Welcome to the Wolf Power Club, the weekly podcast where we discuss energy, industry and politics. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Wolf Power Club podcast, the biggest energy podcast on the Apple podcast charts. Today we're going to look at and ask the serious question, is the new British government trading national security in preference for net zero policy to get the Chinese government on board and grow a relationship that was broken for the last 6 years? So we're going to look at what led to the breakup in relationship 6 years ago and what happened in that intervening time and some of the facts that have made us almost hostile towards each other between Britain and China. We're then going to have a reality check of what the new British government has been doing and essentially the importance that China has in the solar and storage space and the BESS market, and then what the Wolf Power Club feels that needs to be done. Now, at the Wolf Power Club, we don't actually sit there thinking it's easy to do energy and geopolitics is easy, because we're very realistic that essentially it's a difficult world to do energy on any type of energy, and you only have to look at the history and even recent events such as on gas, where essentially even when we make a stand against Russia, the impact you have on your own people from pricing and so on by essentially taking a political position against it. So we don't have any of that, but we are passionate about this British-Chinese relationship because essentially it goes back to a bit of my past of having both studied in China, studied in Hong Kong, and been fortunate enough that very early in my career I got to work with Chris Patten when he was Chancellor of Newcastle, and obviously he was the last governor of Hong Kong, and I was president of the Students' Union there. Went on to actually in my MBA days, having studied in Hong Kong and China, I saw some things I both was fascinated by and passionate by, but also areas that was truly worrying. And I think what we want to get into is the facts. What we don't want to do is some sort of conspiracy story, but really look at that breakdown relationship. When Keir Starmer met the leader of China, President Xi Jinping, in recent times, that was the first time a British Prime Minister had met his Chinese counterpart in 6 years in a one-to-one meeting. Now, although many trade delegations and foreign secretaries have had meetings, it was quite a significant moment as a result of that. But essentially, the reason the relationship broke down comes down to a few key moments over the last few years. And I think we go back to 2020 and 2021, when essentially it was declared by the British government that it was a security risk to have Huawei part of our 5G networks. And it was declared in the Telecom Security Bill that no undesirable actors can be part of the 5G network, that all future business has to be stopped, and any legacy stuff has to be out of the system in 2027. What it meant was that essentially Oliver Dowden passed a bill that basically stopped Huawei being part of the telecoms 5G infrastructure in the UK, and basically the basis was based on British intelligence and what happened. The Chinese defence on Huawei felt it was politically arranged to support America because America had done various attempts to block the likes of Huawei and TikTok and various systems, and essentially therefore that was the challenge. But actually we can see that although China is a massive trade partner of the UK in its top 10, this bill was passed because there was genuinely clear security risk that our telecoms network having Chinese ownership and Huawei's too close to the Chinese government relationship was not good for British national security. It then grows in 2021 following terrible political acts that happened in Hong Kong. And for our listeners who might not know the full history about Hong Kong, is that obviously in 1997 Chris Patten was the last governor of Hong Kong, and there was a bill handed over that from 1997 to 2047, so a 50-year period, Hong Kong would enjoy the freedoms it had under British law, even though it was returning to essentially reporting into China. Now, what happened was there was this national securities bill passed on Hong Kong, which basically gave China increased rights to lock up democratic and peaceful protesters in Hong Kong. What we then saw was outrage from the British government about this, and Boris Johnson basically passed an act that any Hong Kong resident or Hong Kong national could get a British overseas passport and move back to the UK on permanent residency. Now, what we saw in the numbers, and this shows that both the potential threat that those Hong Kong people who had allegiances to Britain felt and those who basically had issues with the Chinese government felt, was the Hong Kong population in Britain grew from 135,000 to 285,000. Now, we're not talking ancient history here, we're talking the period from 2021 to 2024. And that was a stance by Boris Johnson's government that essentially it was not all right. So you have the telecoms bill, you have the opportunity that the people of Hong Kong, and I've had very, very close relationships with Hong Kong over the years. It's a very, very special place, and you can therefore see that there's their bit. And then there's the third bit of essentially when the war in Ukraine broke out and the EU, Britain and America put sanctions on Russian oil and gas, because essentially those sanctions would stop financial flow into the Kremlin's coffers to fund the war. You actually saw that the excess gas and oil that suddenly was cheaper on the market was massively bought up by China. So not only do they have the human rights thing about people in Hong Kong, but you could argue that Chinese energy transactions were funding Russian efforts to keep up the last 24 months and more of, or we're going well north of 30 months now, of going into Ukraine and being able to. Now, we want to look at the economic reality here, and essentially why is Labour committed, and the new government that came in July 2024, of getting close to China. A huge part of it is the road to net zero and the energy policy. And the reason for that is a number of key factors. The first is that China leads the BESS market, or the battery energy storage market, which essentially is when you have renewable fuels, whether it's wind, whether it's solar, whether it's tidal, sometimes when the power is produced is different from when the power is needed. So actually sustainable fuels need a huge amount of reliance on the BESS market. Now the forecast is by 2030 the BESS market is going to be worth somewhere between 120 and 150 billion dollars. Now the reason why it means that China is so heavily involved now in the British government energy policy is that China currently in the BESS market makes up 58% of that market. Now, to then look at it further, when we were at Solar and Storage this September, when we launched the Wolf Power Club, there was a huge amount of exhibitors from China, huge amount of people from China that come over to the Birmingham NEC. Now the next Solar and Storage is in April, and we hope to be catching up with those companies. But essentially they have come experts in the production of solar panels, of energy storage, and of batteries. In addition to that, recently BYD hosted a group of British civil servants where they showed how they were reducing the weight, reducing the cost by potentially nearly up to 40% of battery technology, and that essentially the batteries coming out of China will be some of the leading in the world. And this was also confirmed by Porsche, saying the wonders that the Chinese companies are doing on battery breakthrough. However, and this comes to the national security part, is that there is a lot of challenge to the Chinese government's actions on this. There's a huge amount being raised about the human rights and certain groups that are being targeted, especially some of the Chinese Muslim population that are suffering huge amounts for mining these metals, and actually there is huge human rights violations being accused at this moment of time. What we saw though is that in November, Keir Starmer came the first British Prime Minister in 6 years to meet President Xi Jinping. Then on top of that, our Chancellor Rachel Reeves has gone to China this January to raise money, and some people have called it the begging, and that she's tried borrowing and now she's begging to try and up her business. And Ed Miliband, the Energy Secretary, has talked about the importance of growing our energy storage. So you look at all these things together and you think, wow, does that mean we are leading ourselves to being dependent on China? Well, certainly there's already a trade deficit. So China is in the United Kingdom's, depending on what KPIs you use, between top 10 and top 5 trading partners. And in the latest figures from the recent year of 2024, we exported, UK to China, around about £35 billion worth of goods. But in the other direction came £77 billion worth of goods. So you can see how much the trade deficit is with China. On top of that is that essentially, because of their prowess in the BES market, is that essentially all of these green industries that we see that potentially might well need battery storage, that our partners potentially were going down the China route. The final thing that's being challenged to Ed Miliband is that one of the ways to get net zero is outsourcing your carbon. And one of the ways to outsource your carbon is to outsource production of major goods and so on that your country does today to China. So for instance, as an example, in the car industry, at the moment there's quite strong quotas on companies outside of the UK cars coming in, and when we were part of the EU, very strong quotas of cars coming in there. But essentially, if you, to help trade wheels, say more of those cars can come in, essentially you mean that the production of carbon is moved also geographically, so helping your 2030 and 25 targets, that happens. So the reality is that the new government sees China as an excellent source for this storage and solar, and what we're saying is there's huge issues around that, because essentially you are trading energy policy and net zero for potentially national security, going back to what we covered in the first part of this podcast about human rights in Hong Kong, supporting Russia on Ukraine, and then also the actual production of electricity itself. There's been many question marks raised. So now we have to ask the question, well, what should we do? What's Wolf Power Club's view? Well, I think first of all, do not celebrate, I actually think, poor successes. So Rachel Reeves came back from China this week talking about £600 million of extra deals. But when trade one way is 35 billion, the other way 77 billion, it's a bit like saying a waiter gave me incredible service and yet I gave them less than a 1% tip of the bill. So basically 600 million is no great increase on our market share, and it really does feel like kind of China were very pleasant to her, but essentially either rehashing not new stuff, or if it is only 600 million, well, 600 million is a very small amount in the grand scheme of things of already existing China-UK trade. The next bit I would say is there is a due diligence for the British government, in my opinion, to put a financial value of national security into the economic equations about when backing BES technologies. And what I would say is that they should look to create a competitive market from two areas. One, we're a consumer and there'll be a lot of BES needs in the UK. Therefore, what we should be doing is actually asking ourselves, could we back other parts of the market to create long-term competition? Because long-term competition will only ever help then price competitiveness and where technology goes to. And it might well mean that in the short term, as a British government procurement, we might have to pay over the odds for non-Chinese resources, but that will help technology breakthroughs in other areas and other countries and geographies. Whether we can do it homegrown or whether we can do, such areas as supporting the United States, I think it's well worth us looking at the friendly options or the friendlier options that can do that. The next bit I'd say that Britain's phenomenal at is raising capital. Now, the London Stock Exchange is a primary example of that. It's been very, very bad in terms of long-term in British government raising capital for green projects, because of the flip-flopping on policy, the changing of dates and so on. What I think that actually the City of London and the British government should do is to say, look, in part of protecting national security, where can we raise funds together and essentially finances to give people a fighting chance to actually not lead to Chinese either monopoly or oligopoly of the BES market, and that we can get in there. You know, listing all the things that we've had of difficult relationships, I didn't even list parts of Taiwan. I didn't even list about the cyber attacks on British facilities like in the North Sea. And therefore it says to me that we should be looking at all of the options to potentially support and fund the difference. And then the next part is actually, when we are working on the international trade front, is actually be offering services and opportunities where we're not begging, but actually what we're looking to do is be in partnerships and equal partners. I feel that actually we've come across very badly in 24 and 25 as a British government, and essentially has led us to this loss of confidence in our economy. Let's bring back energy security. I think energy security will lead to energy financing, and the two together mean that there'll be alternatives on the BES market. As I say, I'm really open to your guys' thoughts and comments on below. I really also look forward in April to meeting some of the leading companies from China at Solar and Storage, and also I'm more than welcome either Chinese companies or the Chinese government to have a right reply on the podcast. But I do feel it's in British national interest, and I freely accept that I'm very passionate about Hong Kong and the history of Hong Kong. And I do ask myself the question, the reason the population has increased from 135,000 to 285,000 of British Hong Kong citizens in the UK is because of the field effect of drainage. What I'm saying is, on the Wolf Power Club, net zero is important, but also security energy is very important. Look forward to your thoughts and feedbacks, and if you enjoy this type of video, we'll do more of it soon. Thank you very much, guys.